This week's First Chapter Friday is Rez Dogs by Joseph Bruchac, and this is a novel in verse written about a girl who goes to live with goes to visit her grandparents on the Wabanaki reservation, and then the coronavirus hits. So it's kind of about her experience living with her grandparents on the reservation during that time. So I'm going to read the first chapter or two. Many of you probably heard of Joseph Bruchac. He's written a lot of, he's pretty local. He lives just across the lake in New York State and has written a lot about the native tribes of this area. Chapter 1, Malsum. When Malian woke up and looked out her window, the dog was there, just as she had dreamed it would be. It was lying on the driveway, halfway between their small house and the road. It wasn't sleeping. Its head was up, its ears erect, its paws in front of it, as if on guard. As Malian watched, the dog turned its head to look right at her, as if it knew her, as if it had known her for a long, long time. Malsum, she said, Kwai, kwai, Nidoba. Hello, hello, my friend. The big dog nodded and then turned back to continue watching the road. Malsum. That was the old name for a wolf. It was a good one for that dog. It was as big as a wolf. It looked like the videos of wolves she'd watched on her phone. The only things different about it were the white spots over each of its eyes. Four-eyed dog, a soft voice said from back over her shoulder. It was Grandma Frances. Malian had not heard her come up behind. She was used to that. Both her grandparents could walk so softly that she never knew they were there until they spoke. Grandma Frances would tease her about it. Be careful, granddaughter. You don't want to let no Indian sneak up on you. Grandma Frances put her hand on Malian's shoulder. Looks to me like he thinks he belongs here, she said. Then she chuckled. Or maybe like he thinks he owns this place. Would that be okay? Malian said. Grandma Frances chuckled again. It seems to me it's not up to us. When a dog like that just appears and chooses you, it's not your decision. Can I go outside and see what he does? Malian said. Let's ask your grandpa. Roy, get in here. But Grandpa Roy was already there. I've been listening to every word. Seems to me if you step outside and then move real slow whilst you watch what he does, you'll be okay. But just in case, I'll be right behind you. Malian shook her head. Remember what they said? You and Grandma should not go outside. It's too dangerous. You might get that virus. That's why I can't go home to Mom and Dad. And we're gall darn lucky you're here with us, Grandpa Roy said. That old saying about how we don't know what we do without you sure makes sense these days. So I'll stay inside, but you stay in too. Just open the door and we'll see what he does. Malian cracked open the door. The dog stood up and turned her way. He opened his mouth and let his tongue hang out, in what she knew had to be a smile. She held out her wrist. Malsum, she called, her voice soft but sure. The big dog walked over and sniffed her hand. Malsum, she said again, dropping down to one knee as she placed her hand on his broad head. The dog looked at her, straight into her eyes, and he held her gaze. He seemed to Malian that she could see intelligence and even a hint of humor and a kind of certainty. Malsum nodded his head as if to say, yes, that can be my name. I'm here for you. Then he licked her fingers before turning around and going back, heavy muscles rippling beneath his skin, to drop himself down where he had been. Guess he's guarding us for sure, Grandpa Roy said. Looks like you got yourself a new friend. Chapter 2, Rez Dogs. Malsum was lying on his back, his tongue hanging out, as Malian rubbed his stomach. She was thinking about how cool it was that their names sort of sounded the same, even though his meant wolf, and hers was just the way her old Pennacook people, who didn't use the sound of L, pronounced Marianne. Yup, Grandpa Roy said, nodding his head. There's just no doubt that he's chosen you. He tapped his long index finger on his chin, a gesture her grandfather had often made just before he was about to tell a story. The dogs on any reservation, they have their own lives. They have their own tribes. And when we would travel, like when in the spring we used to go and live by the falls where the fish were running, lots of times the dogs would not go with us. They'd stay in the village and take care of themselves. He chuckled. You know, my grandpa Red Hawk told me how one time when they'd gone to the falls, he realized that he'd left his best knife behind, and so he went back to get it. He also wondered just what the dogs were doing with all the people gone, so he snuck up to the edge of the village. My grandpa could always move real quiet, and he stayed downwind so they couldn't smell him. So I guess none of those dogs knew he was there when he peeked out from behind a tree, and what he saw was the darndest thing. Those dogs were acting just like people. They'd put on clothes we left behind. Some of them were walking around on their hind legs. Some were sitting around the fire, drinking soup from wooden cups that they dipped into a pot they'd been cooking. One of them was even smoking a pipe. Grandpa Red Hawk figured the best thing he could do was just leave those dogs be. So he didn't bother to look for his knife. He just made his way back to the falls. What it showed him was that the dogs could do just fine on their own without us. We humans were lucky they chose to live with us, or maybe it was the other way around, that we were the ones who chose to live with them. The big dog had sat up when Grandpa Roy started to tell that story. As soon as it was done, he stood, shook himself, and then walked over to Grandpa Roy to put one paw in his lap and look into his face. Did I get it right? Grandpa Roy said. Malsum nodded and then went back to lie down in front of Malian. Grandpa Roy smiled. Yep, our Rez dogs are not like them you see in the cities. You'll never get our good friend here being walked around on some fancy leash. Malian smiled back at her grandfather. She always loved it when he told her stories. She also smiled because she knew how true it was about the dogs on the res being different from the dogs in the cities. She noticed that when she was little and made her very first trip to Boston with her parents for her father's interview with that big law firm. She was only 5, but she had to ask, why are all those dogs tied up to people like that? Don't they have any lives of their own? How come they're not just allowed to run free? Her dad went down on one knee, put his hands on her shoulders. It's just kind of the way not only the dogs but the people have to live in the city where they're all so close together. If they're not controlled, they might get hurt or maybe even hurt each other. That was when her mom smiled down at her dad and said, well now, Thomas, it seems to me you could say that we're Rez dogs also. Woof, Malian had said. Woof, woof, woof. And then all 3 of them started barking and laughing together. No one walking by understanding why they were barking. Maybe not even knowing the 3 of them were Indians. Dad in his suit, Mom in her best jeans, and Malian in her new Catholic school uniform. 3 Rez dogs in the city. That was how she saw them back then, and she saw herself still. Chapter 3, Mail Delivery. Balsam sensed the mailman first, as Malian sat with the big dog on the crooked old wooden steps. Her dad had planned to fix those steps after he and her mother got back from the city, but that was before they had to shelter in place in the city, and Malian's weekend visit to her grandparents on the res got stretched out way, way longer. A deep growl started in Malsum's throat. Then he stood up and walked stiff-legged to stand at the end of the walk by the mailbox, 30 feet from their front door. He didn't move as the truck pulled up and a red-haired man in a uniform started to get out. But he stopped as Malsum's growl got louder. Call off your dog, the man yelled, and then started coughing. Malian stayed where she was, and ahead of her now, so did Malsum. The mailman wiped his nose on his sleeve, then held up a box. I got a package you need to sign for. Thank you, mister, Malian called to him. But whatever it is, I don't think I need it. I also think that maybe what you need now is to go see a doctor. The mailman started coughing again. When he stopped, he nodded. Kid, you might be right. Then he smiled, held up his hand. He took a pen from his shirt pocket and scribbled something on a piece of paper stuck to the top of the box. Guess what, he says. It looks to me like you already signed for this. He balanced the package on top of the mailbox. I'll go by the clinic today. He coughed as he slid back behind the wheel. You and Killer there take good care of Roy and Martha Francis. Tell him Al said hi. Lillian waited on the steps until the truck was out of sight, and the big dog came back to her side. Then she put on the vinyl gloves from the box inside the door, pulled out some tissues from the baby wipe dispenser before getting the package. It had been sent by her parents, of course. She wiped it down on every side before opening it. Bears always have to have their sweets, read the note her mom had written. So these are for your grandparents and you, our sweet, sweet girl. Inside were 8 packages of the cookies that she and her grandparents loved. Her father's words written on the back of her mother's note were in smaller print, but they were even sweeter. Malian, you are the best daughter and granddaughter in the whole wide world. We miss you so much, but we're glad you're there. That's the way our Creator meant it to be, that one day young people might know the blessing of being able to take care of those who cared for them when they were young. Give them a hug from both of us. We'll all be together soon. Malsum looked up quizzically, as if asking why he had been left out. Malian knelt and put her arms around Malsum's neck. Don't feel bad, boy. I haven't told him about you yet. She stood up and took her iPhone out. Look at me, she said. Smile for the camera. The big dog looked up, then opened his mouth in a grin so wide it made Malian laugh. All right, she said as she pressed send. My mom and dad are going to be glad that we have such a great new friend. So that's Rez Dogs. If you like dogs, you might enjoy this book. And it's kind of interesting now that we are sort of on the other side of the pandemic to kind of hear about what it was like for different people in different places. So if that's something you're curious about, check out Rez Dogs.